Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Miss Angler's biology class. I am Miss Angler. In today's video, we are going to be covering the introduction to the history of life on Earth. This video is going to walk you through the basics about what you need to know and understand before you move on to more of the complicated topics. It's important that you have this foundation knowledge so you understand how primitive Earth was formed and then how those changes over time resulted in the life on Earth we see today. Now, if you are new here, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed with your notifications turned on because I post every Tuesday and Thursday. Now, what I'd like to do is to take your mind back in time to a very primitive Earth and think about what resources were available and what we could do with them to create life. Now, the first thing that was on Earth would have been water. It wouldn't necessarily be very drinkable water. It might even be acidic, like an acid, but it was a liquid. And this water would have been collecting in big bodies like oceans and lakes. And at this point, we just really had rock and water. We didn't have any living things yet. The next thing we had in large amounts was minerals. Now, when I say minerals, I'm not talking about just like gold and silver. I'm talking about sodium, magnesium, potassium, all these other minerals that are important for life. But again, a mineral is not alive. So how do we actually make something alive? Well, I'm going to get to that soon. The final thing that we had available to us was a set of gases. Now, there was a very different proportion of gases on primitive Earth. Carbon dioxide was much greater. There was also something called methane in the air in far bigger quantities. There was also sulfur. There was a little bit of oxygen, but not like huge amounts like there is today. And so what we need to do is we need to take these raw materials and turn it into life. And that's exactly what happened with the Urey-Miller experiment, which is what we see alongside here. And basically what they did is they set up a set of apparatus to mimic or simulate what primitive Earth looked like and had available to it. And they wanted to see if we just like left this setup to run, would we ever get the building blocks of life? Now, what they did is they took a boiling tube and a boiling flask and they boiled water. Why? Well, it wanted to be a representation of evaporation on Earth and how precipitation in the water cycle works. So we boiled some water and we simulated evaporation. And now we have water vapor moving through this glass tube and then moving into this next chamber over here. Now, this chamber over here is very interesting because it's sort of copying cloud formation. But when you make clouds, more often than not, I don't know if you're aware of this, but when all those little water droplets bump into each other, they produce lightning. Now, lightning was actually a really important resource that we needed for life. Why? Because lightning is such a strong force in nature that it actually has the ability to take elements in the periodic table and stick them together to create something like water, hypothetically. But it also has the strength to do the opposite and take water and split it into hydrogen and oxygen. So lightning is a really strong natural force. The only other thing that is available to us that can do the same thing would be the sun and the radiation from the sun. So what they did is the water vapor collected in this upper chamber, and they said they've got a tungsten electrode here and a little spark. And basically what they did is they electrocuted or shocked the water vapor that collected inside there, pretending like it was lightning striking it. Then they also mixed in some gaseous mixture here. And as you can see, they do have some of the gases we mentioned earlier. We've got methane in here. We've got some ammonia, hydrogen. There's some water in there too. And we all mixed that together. And what interesting thing happened was every time we did a little electric shock, we would break up these components of these gases and these gassy mixes that we had, and we broke them down into things like carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen and oxygen. Now, these four elements are the building blocks of life: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. These four things are what produce all the substances in your body. Most importantly, they produce the building block of life, which is amino acids. Now, this is where the surprising part came. After leaving the apparatus set up and just letting the electricity run through it, they slowly collected the water and condensed it like it would if it was falling as rain. They allowed it to drip down into this collection funnel down here. And what they found was they had produced amino acids. Now, this is very important because what that means is when you have an amino acid, you have the first building block for a protein. If you can get these amino acids to join together in a really long chain, you form a protein. And if you can get many proteins to form together, you can produce a whole structure and then a whole organism. And so what they were trying to prove was even though you have non-living resources available to you, under the right conditions, with some help from a very strong natural force like lightning, we could take something simple like water, methane, ammonia, and we can combine them to form the building blocks of life, which were these amino acids. Now that we have looked at the origins of life on Earth, let us look at the three major factors that influence life on Earth once it actually was established, starting off with the most important one, which is going to be climate. Now, remember, climate is a long-term word. In other words, we're not looking at weather. We are looking at hundreds, thousands of years where a climate has shaped the life on Earth. And one of the most important changes in the climate on Earth is going to be an ice age. Now, ice ages, as the name suggests, is where a huge proportion of the land surface on Earth is covered in ice. And you can see in the two pictures I've included alongside, we have an old picture of Earth from the top. This is looking down on the North Pole. And then we have a diagram showing what Earth looks like today. And you can see there is a massive amount of solid ice on the prehistoric side versus this small piece of ice we are left with. The light blue areas are in reference to sea ice, which is moving, it's changing, it's not solid, and it can actually melt away in the summer months or the warmer months. But as you can see, the ice age that we have moved from, the ice was covering all the way down to the United States. It was covering the majority of Europe, the top parts of China and Russia, whereas today, it barely covers anything, if only perhaps some of Greenland and some of the North Pole. The rest of it is sea ice. Now, why is an ice age important for life on Earth? So, during the ice age, there's obviously lower temperatures, right? That means that if you are not adapted to living in a lower temperature, you are going to die off, you're going to become extinct. The next thing that happens is you have a lot of species migrating towards the equator. And that is because the temperatures are, let's say, better there or warmer there, and so more life can exist. Now, when you put a lot of species in a small space, what happens is you increase competition, and only organisms that are strong enough to compete with one another will survive. The next thing, which is very interesting, is during the Ice Age, the rainfall is actually much lower and it's drier. And that is because the majority of the fresh water is stored in the ice. Now, this also has another domino effect. Because there's so much water stored in the ice, the ocean levels, they actually drop. And that means that the shorelines of land are lower, which means that there is more like rock and beach exposed. And that does open up some places for some organisms to live, but it also means that a lot of coastal areas become drier and fewer organisms can live there because they used to have a water source that was closer to them, and now it's even further away. The next important stage in changing life on Earth is linked to oxygen levels. Now, primitive Earth would have had basically no gaseous oxygen available, because remember, oxygen comes from photosynthesis. If Earth is mostly water and rock, there is no photosynthesis occurring, which means that the levels of oxygen would have been extremely low to non-existent. So how did we get to the current oxygen level of 21% of our atmosphere being oxygen? Well, there is a theory that there were microorganisms on Earth that were respiring, which means that they were going through cellular respiration, and they were making use of the gases methane and carbon dioxide because they were the most prevalent or prominent gases in the atmosphere at the time. But the thing was is that some organisms could do that really well and other organisms really struggled. So what they decided to do was they started to live in a symbiotic relationship, and it improved their survival. And so what you see here is an example of how this may have occurred. We have a cell here that would have absorbed a aerobic prokaryote. So think something like a little bacteria. So two little bacteria start living with one another. The smaller bacteria starts living inside the bigger cell. Along comes a photosynthesizing bacterial cell, and it also gets absorbed into this bigger cell. And now all three of them are living together. And essentially what you have is the photosynthesizing bacteria producing oxygen, and that oxygen can be used by these aerobic prokaryotes or bacteria. So they take in the oxygen, and you have now this like symbiotic relationship where the structures inside the cells are producing gases that are necessary for other organisms to use. And in return, these little aerobic prokaryotes make more carbon dioxide, which is great because you need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. So it was this like self-sustaining cycle. And this is the theory that we suggest about how chloroplasts and mitochondria, they became about, and how we actually got the first amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere. Of course, microorganisms take a very small amount of space. So if there are billions and trillions of these organisms making oxygen, this then raises up the oxygen levels in the atmosphere, and it allows even more diversification to happen, which means more cells can start using oxygen instead of having to struggle to use methane or carbon dioxide, because you had to be very specialized to use those gases. And slowly but surely, these single cells that have these additions to them, they would have started to clump together and formed our first algae. And that would have then clumped together to form our first plant, and so on and so forth, until eventually we had a huge amount of plant life on Earth, mostly in the water, but some of it on the shoreline, creeping its way onto the terrestrial part of the Earth, and that then increased the oxygen levels. Now, the moment oxygen levels increased, again, it opened a whole new space on land for organisms to start living and evolving. Now, what was very interesting is that because oxygen levels were increasing so dramatically on Earth, and they actually got to the point where they were so incredibly high, they were higher than they are today. Today, as I mentioned to you, we are at 21%. In primitive times, like the Carboniferous period, there were so many trees on Earth making so much oxygen that insects during that period of time were enormous. This is a picture of a dragonfly in comparison to the size of a human, if you look down here, and that is enormous. If you think that a dragonfly is actually normally less than half the size of your palm of your hand, in this diagram, they are showing that they would have been the size of cats or even small dogs. And this is because organisms at the time could take oxygen straight into their body, and the oxygen levels were really, really high, about double what they are today. Now, if you ask yourself, why is the change in oxygen important for the diversity on Earth? Well, remember, as I said to you in the beginning, if you provide more oxygen, you provide more opportunities for organisms to evolve and use this new resource that we have provided them. And so we increase the living organism diversity, so we increase biodiversity on Earth. Now, the third and final component that shapes life on Earth, which is also an abiotic factor, is geological events. Now, the main geological event that I want to talk about is going to be linked to this picture over here, which is the movement of the continents, or continental drift. And continental drift refers to how the continents have moved around on Earth, how they've moved in different areas, different latitudes. Remember, the latitude along the Earth, which is, if we have, like, here is the equator, that's the warmest part of the Earth versus the two poles, which are the coldest parts of the Earth. When continents move around these latitude points, they change things like their temperature, they change their rainfall. And remember, when you change the temperature and you change the rainfall, the ultimate outcome is you are going to change the life that you find there. And that means continental drift has really shaped a huge proportion and diversity of life on Earth, because perhaps a million years ago, there was a forest in a location. But today, it's a desert because of continental drift, because there was way more rainfall where the continent was earlier, and now it's moved and shifted, and now it's a desert. And a good example of this would be the Sahara Desert actually was a desert, was a rainforest, I beg your pardon, before, and now has become a desert. And that's due to continental drift. Now, the second thing that shapes life on Earth is going to have to be volcanic eruptions. Again, this is something that can dramatically change life on Earth because of what volcanic ash can do. Volcanic ash can block the sunlight. And if you block the sun, you are going to impact the plants. So the plants can't photosynthesize. And if they can't go through photosynthesis, they can't make oxygen, which means the organisms that are reliant on the oxygen also can't live. And this is often how mass extinctions occur. Volcanic eruptions happen naturally, it just happens. Remember, primitive Earth was very, very active. There was a lot of moving of the continents, a lot of volcanic activity. And so you could have had ash being spewed into the sky, blocking the sun out for years, where organisms became extinct because it was too cold, there was not enough oxygen in the atmosphere, and they ended up dying. Now, linked to volcanic eruptions, which is our third and final piece when it comes to geological events and what shapes life on Earth, is going to be earthquakes. Now, earthquakes are linked to volcanic eruptions. Generally, they go hand in hand. When a volcano erupts, there is some kind of earthquake that's also linked to it. But more specifically, earthquakes can separate land. And so what that means is it was a big piece of land. It's now broken into two pieces of land. So if we started off with a really large piece of land, we can end up having two smaller pieces of land, but those two pieces can actually float away from each other, taking all the organisms and the plants and animals with it. And that means that maybe this area over here is hotter and this area is colder, and you end up having life that started off in an area that was hot. It's broken into two, but now the organisms are moving into different locations, which means they're going to experience different climates, and then the organisms that live there are going to have to adapt or become extinct. Again, another event that can shape the life that lives there. So now that we have looked at the things that have shaped life on Earth, we need to look at how that life on Earth has changed over time, and that's when we talk about the geological time scale. Now, to start this section, I just want to give some tips about how to study the scale. First of all, I suggest that you get clarity from your teacher about how much of this do you need to know. Do you need to know exactly what happened in every period and the name of every era? Or do you just simply need to know when there were major events like extinctions or perhaps major speciation events where lots of species appeared very quickly? That is different in every school, so I suggest you find that out first. But to break down what we are looking at when we do work with the geological timescale is we are looking at three divisions within this picture, which is going to be the era at the top here, the period, and then the major events that have occurred on Earth. Now, when we look at this time scale, we are going up from the oldest time to the newest time, so the most recent, where we are right now. And I want you to notice that the time scales are not all equal in terms of length. You'll see that some are longer than others. Now, when it comes to the occurrences in each of these, first of all, we need to look at the eras, which are these sections over here. And basically, the eras refer to the major life organisms and stage of Earth at the time. In other words, these words like Paleozoic and Mesozoic, they refer to the geological look of the planet, like how much water and rock and space is available, and how much land there is. It also is in reference to how much like life on Earth there was. But then when you look at the periods are subdivisions of eras, and that is because during those eras, there were some major changes in the life on Earth. Maybe there were dinosaurs appearing or disappearing. Maybe it was the first amphibian that appeared. Generally, the names of these particular periods are linked to the organism that was key during that time. For example, if we go down to the Devonian period, it gets its name because of the first amphibian and fish diversity that was occurring during that time. But if we go up to something that we are more familiar with, like Triassic and Jurassic, this is in reference to the type of dinosaurs that were around during that period, as they were the major organism on Earth. Both actually very different kinds of dinosaurs over this time, because this would have been millions of years. And that's also important, is to note the time scale. We are working in millions of years, not thousands of years. Now, the other thing I want to bring your attention to is what happens in these stages and what is and isn't important. So first things first, this era down here, you will notice, doesn't have a period name. There's nothing written here. Generally, we call this the Precambrian era, and it's actually an unknown space. It actually continues beyond 650 million years ago, but because very few things made fossils back then, we don't actually know how old that era is. You see, everything that was alive during that Precambrian time was all soft-bodied, as they mention over here, and that means they didn't have a skeleton that could be left behind when they died that could turn into a fossil. So we have imprint fossils, we have very, very, very rare mold fossils, things that are left behind that are very difficult to make. But the problem is you need a hard substance to turn into a fossil. If you're mostly a soft-bodied organism, like a worm, you won't leave anything behind. It's very rare for cast and imprint fossils, like an imprint of their body, to be left behind. Then moving upwards, we enter into the Cambrian period. Now, the Cambrian period is actually another very important period because this is where diversity exploded. We call it the Cambrian explosion. And that means we had an enormous amount of diversification in terms of animals. We had the first fish, we had the first chordate. A chordate means it has a backbone or a spinal cord, and this is massive. This means that we went from soft-bodied, simple organisms to organisms that are complex with lots of different systems and organs. We then progressed over some time and we get to the Silurian period. This is important because this is the first time we have vascular land plants. And that means finally life is moving on to Earth. It's becoming a little bit more stable. And the moment we also entered into this phase, this is where the ozone layer would start to form and make life on the surface of the Earth a lot easier because plants are making oxygen. And as I mentioned earlier, oxygen is really important for forming the ozone layer. We then progressed a little bit further, and now we get to some mass extinctions. Let's have a look at the Permian period, and that is one of our biggest mass extinctions. And what's interesting is we don't realize that we have gone through many mass extinctions, but the Permian in particular was really deadly. If we compare it to others, about 95% of all life disappeared during the Permian period. Moving on, we've got the first mammals in the Triassic period, and we've got dinosaurs in the Jurassic going on to the Cretaceous. That's another dinosaur period. And now, very interestingly, that is where we had the first flowering plants, which means that's the first time we would have had pollinators. If you think about it, you don't need flowers if you don't have pollinators. So this would have been the first time we would have had like bees be responsible for pollination. Before, it would have been wind, it would have been water, it might have been other animals like brushing up against the various plants to like spread their seeds or to spread their spores, because probably at this time it was only spores. Pollen only came much, much later. This is also where the extinction of the dinosaur happened. And now we're in the Cenozoic period, the Cenozoic era, which is this period over here. And it's made up of 3 parts. And this is now the mammal era. We are in the mammal era now. This is where mammals are dominating the space. Previously, we had domination of reptiles over here. We had domination of amphibians and ocean life, so all aquatic life. And so now it's interesting to see if mammals are not going to continue to be the dominant group on Earth, what could be the next organism that dominates the space? And remember, that is all dependent on the ecosystems and the abiotic factors. How much light, space, water, what is the temperature? That will all impact the next geological time scale period. Now, very unusually for me, everybody, we are not going to have a terminology recap on this particular topic because we haven't actually covered very many terms in this section. It's rather been an understanding lesson, like how do you move from having no life on Earth to having life on Earth, and then that life diversifying and becoming so extensive. So in future videos, there will be some terminology that I will need you to know, but I will obviously include that. And there are going to be many more videos on the history on life on Earth. We're going to touch in on missing links, fossil formations, and so much more. So I will see you all again soon. Bye.